It's a Tuesday night, sometime around 1957. The kitchen windows have fogged up from the oven heat. A formica table is set with mismatched plates. The smell coming from that oven is something heavy and warm and deeply familiar. Ground beef, onions, maybe a little something creamy holding it all together. Mom pulls out a dish and sets it right in the center of the table. Nobody takes a picture of it. Nobody writes it down. It's just Tuesday. It's just dinner. It's just the kind of food that made a house feel like a home. And then one day, without any announcement, without any farewell, dishes like that one simply stopped appearing on American tables. No funeral. No final supper. They just disappeared. That moment. That kitchen. That smell. It meant something real. It meant someone was home. It meant the day was done, and the family was together. And it wasn't fancy food. Nobody was pretending. It was ground beef stretched into something generous, something filling. Something that fed 5 or 6 people on a modest budget, and somehow still tasted like love, managed to find its way into the baking dish. The 1950s, 1960s, and into the 1970s were the great age of the American casserole. Home economists were celebrated figures. Women's magazines ran casserole features every single month. Condensed soup became a pantry staple that changed the way an entire generation cooked. Ground beef was affordable and versatile, and it showed up in everything. Communities shared these dishes at church potlucks and neighborhood block parties. Cookbooks printed in those decades are full of recipes that nobody makes anymore. These weren't failures. These were beloved dishes that fed millions of American families across countless ordinary evenings. And somewhere along the way, they got left behind. Today on Candlewick America, we're going to remember them. All 25 of them. 25 forgotten ground beef casseroles from mid-century America that have quietly vanished from our tables. We're going to sit with each one for a moment. We're going to remember the kitchens they came from. Let's bring them back, at least in memory. Number 1. Beef and biscuit bake. Imagine a bubbling layer of seasoned ground beef and vegetables somewhere beneath a golden blanket of homemade drop biscuits. The biscuits would sink slightly at the edges and absorb all that savory steam from below. The tops would turn just barely brown. You'd pull it apart with a fork and those biscuits would be half fluffy and half soaked through with the beef filling beneath them. It was the kind of dish that looked humble but hit the table like a celebration. Church ladies made this one for funeral dinners. It showed up at potlucks and came home in an empty dish every single time. Somewhere in the shift toward convenience and the pull of fast food, the biscuit bake quietly walked out the back door and never came back. Number 2. Cheeseburger casserole. This one tried to capture everything beloved about a drive-in burger and layer it into a baking dish. Ground beef, soft cooked onions, something tangy and a little sharp from processed cheese that would melt completely through the whole thing. Sometimes there was a pickle note in there somehow. It tasted unmistakably like a Saturday afternoon at the drive-in, but it came out of a home oven on a weeknight. Kids absolutely adored it. Dads went back for seconds. It had a cheerful, almost playful quality to it, and that probably made it seem too casual for a generation that eventually started associating home cooking with something more ambitious. It faded away just as the drive-ins themselves were fading. Number 3. Hamburger and noodle supreme. The word supreme was doing a lot of work in mid-century recipe naming. This dish was ground beef mixed through with egg noodles, some kind of creamy binding sauce, and a breadcrumb topping that would go crisp and golden in the oven. It was deeply satisfying in the way only a starch-on-starch kind of dish can be. The noodles would soften into the sauce and the beef would distribute evenly throughout, so every bite had a little bit of everything. It was the kind of dish that completely disappeared from the table as a meal in itself. The era of the casserole topping made everything feel special, and breadcrumbs toasted in butter on top of a creamy noodle dish is something nobody who grew up eating it ever truly forgot. Number 4. Green bean and hamburger scallop. Before green bean casserole became the universal Thanksgiving side, there was this. Ground beef joined the green beans, and the whole thing was layered in a way that felt almost architectural. Thin sliced potatoes sometimes appeared in this version, and there was always a creamy element binding it all. The term scallop in old recipe language referred to a layered baking method. It had nothing to do with the seafood. Families made this one because the green beans made it feel virtuous and the beef made it filling. It fed a crowd inexpensively. Today, we kept the green beans. kept the cream of mushroom soup, but we lost the beef. And nobody seems to remember this slightly more substantial ancestor of the holiday classic. Number 5. Spanish rice beef bake. This one was deeply American in how it interpreted the word Spanish. There was nothing particularly Spanish about it, except that it involved rice, tomatoes, and a gentle warmth of flavoring that felt vaguely Southwestern to a 1950s Midwestern home cook. Ground beef was mixed through long-grain rice, diced tomatoes, a little green bell pepper, and baked until the rice had absorbed everything and turned tender and almost sticky in the best possible way. The top would get just slightly caramelized where the tomato caught the heat. It was a one-dish meal that cost almost nothing to make and delivered a comfort that was uniquely its own. It disappeared partly because actual Tex-Mex cooking eventually arrived in mainstream America and made this gentler version seem unnecessary. Number 6. Beef and macaroni bake. Not to be confused with macaroni and cheese with meat added, this was its own creation. The macaroni was fully cooked first, then combined with a tomato-forward beef sauce, and the whole thing was baked until the pasta on top turned just slightly chewy at the edges, while staying tender underneath. Some versions had cheese on top, some didn't. The ones without cheese had a particular rustic quality, like something that came straight out of a farmhouse tradition. Children grew up eating this and thought of it as ordinary. It was ordinary. That's exactly what made it beautiful. And when families started gravitating towards spaghetti and lasagna as their pasta of choice, the humble macaroni bake simply stepped aside and never stepped back in. Number 7. Stuffed pepper casserole. Not stuffed peppers themselves, which you can still find occasionally. This was the casserole interpretation of stuffed peppers. All the same flavors: green bell pepper, ground beef, rice, tomato, a little seasoning. But instead of the theatrical individual presentation of a whole pepper standing upright, everything was chopped, combined, and baked flat in a dish. It was faster. It was arguably easier to serve. It fed more people, but it lost the visual drama that made stuffed peppers feel like a special occasion meal. This casserole version got lost in a strange middle ground, too casual to feel special, too involved to feel like everyday cooking, and so it quietly vanished. Number 8. Beef and potato hot dish. Out of the upper Midwest, out of Minnesota and Wisconsin and the Dakotas, came this deeply regional dish that most of the rest of the country never really knew existed. Ground beef was layered beneath sliced potatoes that would cook through in the oven until they were almost translucent and tender. A simple, creamy sauce held everything together. Sometimes there were onions. Sometimes a can of something cream-based. The word hottish is itself a regional term that the rest of America finds slightly puzzling. But inside those communities, this was comfort food of the highest order. Lutheran church basements knew this dish intimately. As those communities changed and populations shifted, the dish traveled with the people who loved it, but it never made the leap into the mainstream. Number 9. Cantonese beef casserole. This one is a perfect artifact of its time. In the 1950s and early 1960s, Chinese-American food fascinated the suburban home cook. But access to authentic ingredients was limited, and cooking knowledge was filtered through women's magazines and community cookbooks. The result was dishes like this one: ground beef with a little soy sauce, maybe some water chestnuts if you were feeling adventurous, possibly some canned bean sprouts, baked in a dish that barely resembled anything from any Chinese kitchen anywhere. But it had an exotic quality that felt exciting at the time. It was an America trying to look outward while still cooking from pantry staples. It belongs to its era completely, and it couldn't have survived into a time when actual Chinese cuisine became widely available. Number 10. Hamburger corn pone pie. The name alone is worth sitting with. Corn pone is a southern cornbread tradition, and somewhere along the way, someone had the inspired idea to use a cornbread-style topping instead of biscuits over a seasoned ground beef filling. The cornbread would bake right on top, pulling the steam and flavor up into itself as it cooked. The bottom would be soft and saturated with the beef mixture. The top would be golden and slightly crumbly. It was sweet and savory in the best possible way. This dish had particular popularity in the South and in rural communities across the country. It was Depression-era cooking that survived into post-war abundance. And when the post-war generation eventually left their parents' kitchens behind, this dish went with them, forgotten in the transition. Number 11. Beef and rice pilaf bake. Pilaf was a word that entered the American home cooking vocabulary in the late 1950s and carried a sense of elegance. It suggested something from elsewhere, something refined, and home cooks embraced it. This casserole combined ground beef with rice prepared in a pilaf style, meaning the rice was toasted slightly before liquid was added, giving it a nuttier flavor. The whole thing was baked until the rice was fluffy and separate and the beef was distributed throughout in small savory pieces. It tasted more sophisticated than it was. That was the whole point. The ambition of this dish, that slightly elevated quality, was exactly what made it appealing in its time. And then, actual pilaf, made in restaurants and with genuine technique, made the home casserole version feel unnecessary. Number 12. American chop suey bake. American chop suey is still remembered in certain parts of New England, but the baked casserole version of it has almost entirely disappeared. The stovetop version, which is really just beef and elbow macaroni and tomato sauce, is the ancestor here. But when someone decided to take that same combination and slide it into a baking dish with a cheese topping and let the oven do its work, something genuinely different happened. The macaroni at the edges would crisp up slightly. The cheese on top would form a crust. The whole dish would become something more unified and slightly more elegant than the stovetop original. It tasted like the weeknight version of something company-worthy. New England school cafeterias made it for decades, and then it just stopped appearing. Number 13. Ground beef and cabbage scallop. Cabbage and ground beef have a long history together across many cultures. Stuffed cabbage rolls appear in Polish, Hungarian, Ukrainian, and Jewish cooking traditions. But this American casserole version didn't bother with the rolling. The cabbage was chopped, layered with ground beef, and baked with a tomato-based sauce until the cabbage turned soft and sweet from the long oven time. The aroma of this dish cooking was something intensely homey. It filled the house for the entire afternoon. It was cheap and generous and deeply satisfying, but cabbage carries a stigma that it has never entirely shaken. As American food culture moved toward lighter and fresher presentations, dishes built around cooked-down cabbage quietly disappeared from the mainstream recipe conversation. Number 14. Beef and celery cream casserole. Celery is one of the most underappreciated vegetables in American cooking history, and in this dish, it was the star supporting player. Ground beef combined with sliced celery, a cream-based sauce, and baked until the celery softened and became something almost silky, with a mild flavor that somehow made the beef taste even more savory by contrast. Celery was considered a refined ingredient in earlier American cooking. It appeared in formal salads and celebration dishes. This casserole carried some of that quiet elegance. It wasn't flashy. It was restrained and deeply satisfying. As American palates began to chase bolder flavors, this gentle, understated dish faded without a trace. Number 15. Hamburger rarebit bake. Welsh rarebit is a traditional British dish involving a rich cheese sauce served over toast. In mid-century America, someone took the rarebit concept, the thick, seasoned cheese sauce, and poured it over ground beef in a casserole format. The result was intensely rich, deeply savory, the kind of dish that made you want to eat slowly and sit very still afterward. There was often a little mustard in the cheese sauce, sometimes a touch of something like Worcestershire. The beef absorbed all of that sharpness and became something almost sophisticated. It was the most British-influenced dish on this entire list. And as British food influence on American home cooking gradually diminished through the 1970s, rarebit in any form, including this one, simply disappeared from the recipe index. Number 16. Beef and lima bean casserole. Lima beans are genuinely controversial. Children have hated them, and parents have insisted on them for generations. But in this casserole, something transformative happened to the lima bean. Cooked long and slow in the oven with ground beef and a savory sauce, the lima beans lost their starchy resistance and became creamy and mild. They absorbed the flavor of everything around them and contributed a richness to the overall texture that was hard to replace. This was Depression-era frugality made delicious. Lima beans were filling and cheap and nutritious. Combined with beef, they made a complete and generous meal. But lima beans never recovered their reputation from the dinner table battles of the 1950s. And when the kids grew up and started cooking for themselves, the lima bean casserole was left firmly in the past. Number 17. Tamale pie. Not quite forgotten, but close enough to include here because what most people know as tamale pie today is a pale shadow of the original mid-century version. This dish emerged from the American Southwest and spread across the country through community cookbooks. A ground beef filling seasoned in ways that gestured toward Mexican-American flavors was topped with a cornmeal crust, sometimes a full cornbread-style topping, sometimes something closer to a polenta. The crust would bake golden, and the filling would bubble up around its edges. It was hearty and warmly spiced and deeply satisfying. The version that exists today, in some corners of American cooking, is softer and gentler. The bold, unapologetic original version of tamale pie has largely been forgotten. Number 18. Beef and tomato pudding bake. The word pudding in savory cooking is confusing to modern ears, but in older British-influenced American recipes, a savory pudding referred to a dish with a bread-based component that absorbed liquid and became something custardy and dense. This particular casserole involved a tomato-soaked bread base with ground beef throughout. The bread would completely dissolve into the tomato, creating a thick, rich matrix that held the beef. The result was unlike any other texture in casserole cooking: dense but not heavy, intensely flavored. It required good bread and good tomatoes, and when both were present, it was extraordinary. It's a dish so far outside the current understanding of what a casserole can be that most people wouldn't even recognize it as food their grandparents made. Number 19. Shepherd's casserole. Not shepherd's pie, which still exists and is well loved. This was different. The casserole version skipped the individual baking dish presentation and the dramatic mashed potato topping, and instead layered ground beef with root vegetables and a savory broth, topped not with potatoes but with a savory pastry or a biscuit crust. It was somewhere between a pot pie and a shepherd's pie and a casserole, and it belonged entirely to none of those categories. Rural American communities made this in large rectangular baking dishes because it fed 12 people from one oven. It was practical. It was nourishing. It was the kind of dish that made cold winter evenings feel survivable, and it disappeared when the cultural memory of genuinely hard winters faded from everyday life. Number 20. Beef and corn scallop. Corn and beef is one of those combinations that feels almost architecturally American, and this casserole celebrated that combination without apology. Whole kernel corn, sometimes creamed corn, layered and baked with ground beef and a simple cream sauce, finished with a cracker crumb topping that would toast golden in the oven. The sweetness of the corn against the savoriness of the beef created a balance that was gentle and deeply satisfying. It was a summer casserole in spirit, made when corn was fresh and plentiful, but it could be made with canned corn in the winter and still deliver something genuinely comforting. This dish was a fixture of Midwestern community cookbooks for decades. Then the cookbooks stopped being printed, and the dish went with them. Number 21. Ground beef and spaghetti casserole. Before baked ziti became the default Italian-American oven pasta, there was this. Long spaghetti, broken into pieces and baked with ground beef and a tomato sauce in a casserole format. The spaghetti on the top layer would turn slightly crispy. The spaghetti buried inside would absorb the sauce and become tender. It was a different experience from stovetop spaghetti, more unified. The flavors had time to deepen in the oven. It was the kind of dish that Italian grandmothers would not recognize and might actively resent. But it was deeply American, and it belonged to a generation that was discovering Italian flavors for the first time through a very American filter. Baked ziti and lasagna arrived, and the broken spaghetti casserole was retired without ceremony. Number 22. Hamburger and cheese soufflé bake. Someone in the 1960s decided that ground beef could be made elegant by surrounding it with a soufflé-style egg and cheese mixture. They were right. This dish required more effort than most weeknight casseroles. The eggs had to be separated. The cheese had to be incorporated at the right moment. The timing mattered. But when it worked, it produced something light and rich at the same time, a golden puffed exterior giving way to a creamy interior where the ground beef waited. It was ambitious home cooking. It was the kind of dish someone made when they wanted the family to feel like they were eating something truly special on an ordinary Wednesday. As cooking ambition shifted toward other expressions, this particular dish was left behind, a beautiful idea that simply ran out of cooks willing to attempt it. Number 23. Beef and onion custard casserole. The custard casserole is a category almost entirely forgotten today. The concept involved using a savory egg and milk custard as the binding element rather than a cream sauce or condensed soup. The result was more delicate, more refined. When ground beef was incorporated into a custard base and baked low and slow, it became something almost quiche-like but denser and more substantial. Onions slow cooked into sweetness before being added to the custard. The final dish had an almost translucent quality to the custard portion, with the beef suspended throughout like islands. It was mid-century American cooking at its most quietly elegant. It asked for patience and attention. And it disappeared in an era when both patience and time for cooking were becoming increasingly scarce. Number 24. Western beef bake. The American West has always been a powerful mythology, and in the 1950s and 1960s, that mythology influenced everything from television to dinner tables. This casserole was a direct product of the Western craze. Beef, ranch-style beans, a little heat, maybe some corn, all of it baked together into something that evoked campfires and open ranges from the comfort of a suburban kitchen. It was served in states nowhere near the actual West. It belonged to the imagination of what the West represented, rather than any genuine cowboy cooking tradition. There was something joyful and slightly theatrical about it. And when the Western craze in popular culture eventually faded, this dish went with it, a casualty of shifting cultural enthusiasms. Number 25. Church supper beef bake. We saved this one for last because it's the most important one. Not because it was the most elaborate or the most interesting from a culinary perspective, but because it represents something bigger than any single dish. This was the casserole you brought when someone needed feeding, when a family lost someone, when a new baby arrived, when neighbors moved in. It wasn't one fixed recipe. Every church, every community, every circle of women who knew each other had their own version. Ground beef, something creamy, something starchy, and enough of it to feed a crowd. It was carried in a dish covered with foil and driven across town. It was left on a doorstep with a note. It was passed through the window of a car to hands that were grateful and a little overwhelmed. The church supper beef bake wasn't just food, it was a gesture. It was a language that entire communities spoke fluently. When someone was suffering, you didn't ask what you could do. You made this. You showed up with it. And in the showing up, something essential was communicated that words couldn't quite manage. That language has grown quieter now. The casseroles that carried those messages have mostly disappeared. And we are, perhaps, slightly impoverished for their absence. There's something that happens when you think about food from childhood. It stops being just food. It becomes light. It becomes the particular quality of light in a kitchen at 5 o'clock on a winter afternoon. It becomes the weight of a coat hung by the back door. It becomes the sound of an oven door opening and that rush of warm, savory air that hit you in the face and told you everything was all right, that dinner was coming, that someone had spent the afternoon thinking about feeding you. These 25 casseroles weren't gourmet. Nobody was writing restaurant reviews about them. They didn't photograph well. They didn't have impressive names. They were just the food that mid-century American families made because it was practical and filling and it worked. They were the grammar of a language that a generation used to express care. And when they disappeared from our tables, something more than a recipe was lost. A whole set of gestures went with them. A whole way of expressing love through effort and time in a dish covered in foil. The Formica tables are mostly gone. The foggy kitchen windows belong to houses that may not even be standing anymore. The people who made these dishes are fewer every year. But memory is a remarkable thing. You can't eat a memory, but you can sit with it. You can feel its weight. You can pass it on to someone who never had the chance to taste what you once took for granted on an ordinary Tuesday night in 1957. Here at Candlewick, America, we believe that remembering matters. Not with sadness, but with gratitude. These dishes existed. They fed real people. They were made with real hands. And for one generation at least, they were everything. Now here is the question we want to leave you with today. We want you to go back to your own kitchen memories. Maybe it's not a casserole. Maybe it's something else entirely. But we want you to think about one dish from your childhood that you have never seen served anywhere else. Not in a restaurant, not in someone else's home. Just in yours. Just the dish that belonged to your family's kitchen and nowhere else in the world. Tell us about that dish in the comments below. Don't give us the recipe. Just tell us what it smelled like. Tell us what occasion it appeared on. Tell us whose hands made it. That's what we're here for on this channel. The stories behind the food. The memories that live in flavors and aromas, and the specific weight of a serving spoon. If you find meaning in these kinds of conversations, if you believe that food history is actually people history, then Candlewick America is the place you've been looking for. We put out new videos every week. We sit quietly with the food that shaped this country and the people who made and ate it. No rush, no noise. Just memory and warmth and the kind of storytelling that takes its time. Subscribe to this channel and stay at the table with us. There are so many more stories to tell, and we think you'll want to hear every single one.